A fine layer of greenish powder drifted through the air, illuminated by the thin slivers of sunlight that filtered through what remained of the canopy. Branches drooped beneath the weight of vines, which spiraled like snakes over one another, smothering every last remnant of the forest's original shape. At ground level, the earth itself had become something of a treacherous carpet, shifting continuously as fibrous roots pulsed and searched for fresh material. There was no mistaking it. The jungle was alive in a way it had never been before. No one knew exactly when the transformation began. Perhaps it started in the farmland outside the capital, or maybe it took root deep in the rainforests. The only certainty was that this new breed of greenery emerged after years of humanity's voracious hunger for productivity. Over-reliance on chemical fertilizers had introduced subtle genetic shifts into local flora, fueling their growth in unnatural ways. By the time the warning signs appeared, mysterious disappearances, entire villages swallowed whole, it was too late. The green strain, as the survivors called it, had spread like a plague, converting ordinary plant life into predators. Avery crouched behind a decaying trunk, scanning the surroundings with a cautious eye. She recalled the days when forests were still places of solace, a refuge for hikers and travelers, a swath of majestic trees and delicate undergrowth. Now every rustle made her heart race. A single brush of a leaf could signal a lurking trap, each vine waiting for warm-blooded prey to feed its bloated hunger. With slow movements, Avery unhooked a small machete from her belt. It was dull in places, but it served well enough to hack away at grabbing tendrils. She was not alone. Glenn, a lean man with a quiet resolve, had been her companion since the cataclysm began. He flew into her life on the same day everything changed, and though they rarely spoke of the details, they had formed a bond. Glenn moved silently, scanning the trees for telltale signs of danger. Suspicious blossoms with glistening petals, broad leaves that appeared more animate than any plant should. His left arm bore a scar from an encounter with one of the mutated vines, a nightmarish memory that still plagued his dreams. They were headed for a rumored settlement called Blossom's Edge, said to be nestled on the edge of the jungle where the mutant vegetation had been partially controlled. According to chatter among survivors, someone there had discovered a deterrent. A compound that could repel carnivorous plants for a limited time. It was no cure, but it bought precious minutes to escape when the vines snapped toward a living body. Avery and Glenn held on to a rare hope that they could find something at Blossom's Edge to help them endure, if not fight back. Yet even the path to Blossom's Edge was fraught with peril, an uncharted corridor through tangles of mutated green. Vined predators spread their trap-lace snares across every approach, and the flora's predatory instincts seemed eerily intelligent. Now and again, large pods shaped like bellflowers hissed gently, exhaling a hallucinogenic mist that dulled senses and lured unsuspecting creatures, human or otherwise, to their doom. Avery pressed a piece of torn cloth over her mouth and nose, her eyes watering from the pungent fragrance. Glenn tapped Avery's shoulder, silently pointing toward movement ahead. Just beyond a cluster of thick roots, something huge slithered across the fallen leaves. In hushed horror, they watched a throng of vines converge around a hapless creature, a large rodent of some kind. It squealed once, then went silent, its body disappearing beneath writhing layers of green appendages. Neither of them breathed until the vines receded, as if returning to their dormant state. Avery wiped sweat from her brow, her mouth drawing into a grim line. They both knew that the same fate could befall them if they were not careful. The jungle was a minefield of living vegetation, and the slightest misstep would cost them their lives. Moving forward required a delicate dance. Glenn used a long stick to probe the ground, checking for hidden traps. Meanwhile, Avery scanned the canopy for those giant pods that had developed an appetite for flesh. The stench of decay was common in these woods, a testament to countless unlucky travelers and beasts. It was disconcerting to see the vegetation thriving on such remains. Wherever they found tangles of twisted bone, new shoots sprouted with alarming vibrancy. After traveling for hours in tense silence, the pair stumbled into a small clearing. An ancient truck lay rusted near the center, its tires flattened and body consumed by an onslaught of moss and creeping vines. The forest had reclaimed it, turning steel and rubber into a new kind of nutrient. Avery signaled for Glenn to halt. She cautiously approached the truck, meager hope kindling within her. Perhaps they would find some supplies left behind in the cab. She tugged at the door, and it groaned, stuck fast beneath layers of moss. Glenn joined her, helping pry it open. Inside, the seats were disintegrating, a foam-filled husk coated in green mold. A few tins of food lay scattered, their labels too faded to read. She picked one up. It felt dangerously light, almost certainly compromised. Still, two were intact based on the slight rattle inside. A true windfall in these parts. Avery slipped them into her backpack, but something else drew their attention. A tattered journal resting on the dashboard. Its pages were warped by moisture and mold, but parts of it were still legible. Carefully, Avery flipped through the notes. The final entries were harrowing accounts of a father and daughter fleeing from a small farming village. The father described a creeping dread. "They're in the cornfields now. We can't burn fast enough. I fear it's no use." On the last page, a single line was scrawled in trembling handwriting. "Not safe. Evacuate or perish." The dried blotches of ink looked suspiciously like blood. A sudden snap of a branch in the distance made Avery freeze. She motioned for Glenn to get behind the truck. Voices, human voices, carried from among the trees. At first it was impossible to distinguish any words. Then a second voice, louder, became clear. "Stop dragging your feet, will you?" the shout echoed, laced with frustration and a desperation that Avery understood all too well. "Do you see them?" asked Glenn, his hushed question barely audible. Avery peeked around the truck. 3 figures materialized from the undergrowth. The tallest carried a rifle slung over her shoulder, the shorter figure limped, and the last, distinguishable by a colorful scarf, appeared anxious. The trio kept glancing around, clearly fearing an ambush not only from the plants but from other survivors who might exploit them. Though paranoid, they were also clearly frightened. Avery felt a pang of shared sympathy. All humans in these parts had the same haunted look. She signaled Glenn to stay low. They'd learned that trust in this new world was rarely rewarded, and it was safer to observe before revealing themselves. One of the figures noticed the rusted truck and nudged the others. They approached with caution, just as Avery had, circling the vehicle. The one with the rifle stepped forward, scanning the surrounding forest for threats. Had they spotted Avery and Glenn's footprints in the moss? Moments later, the anxious figure with the scarf gasped. He bent to pick something off the ground, a small plastic wrapper. Avery's heart sank. It must have fallen from her backpack. The 3 travelers searched the vicinity more frantically, certain that someone else was nearby. Glenn and Avery exchanged a resigned glance. They would have to reveal themselves or risk a misunderstanding, possibly a rash reaction. Quietly, Avery rose from behind the truck, her palms raised in a gesture of peace. Glenn followed suit. The armed stranger whirled around, pointing the rifle at them, finger tight on the trigger. For a tense moment, no one moved. Avery took a slow breath and tried to keep her voice steady. "We're just passing through," she said. "We mean no harm. We've got nothing worth taking anyway." The rifle wielder's eyes narrowed. "I've heard that one before. Prove it." Avery dropped her pack to the ground, nudging it open with her foot to reveal very few items. Mostly water filters, a single half-empty water flask, and the 2 sealed tins of food. Glenn followed her lead, showing that aside from the machete and a short blade, they were not brimming with useful supplies. After a tense pause, the woman lowered her rifle, though she didn't sling it away. "We're looking for a place called Blossom's Edge," she said. "You heard of it?" Avery nodded warily. "That's where we're headed, or at least we're trying to get there. We've heard rumors it's safer than most places." A faint spark of hope crossed the faces of the 3 strangers. The limping individual, whose pants leg was torn to reveal a bandaged calf, leaned heavily on his companion's shoulder. "We should move," he muttered, his voice weak. "This place is too open." Glenn stepped forward, raising a hand carefully. "We know a route, but it's no walk in the park. The deeper you go, the more traps you'll find." We can pool our knowledge, maybe get there together. The rifle wielder, whose name they soon learned was Dana, glanced at her companions, who introduced themselves in trembling voices. Marco with the bandaged leg, and Nisreen with the colorful scarf. They all wore expressions that betrayed exhaustion, fear, and a spark of desperate hope. After a brief discussion among themselves, the new trio agreed to join forces with Avery and Glenn, albeit with obvious caution. They carefully navigated out of the clearing, forming a loose protective circle. Dana took the lead, rifle raised, while Avery stayed close behind, machete ready for slicing through any vines that got too close. Glenn and Nisreen supported Marco in the back, pausing occasionally whenever the injured man stumbled. It wasn't long before they heard a strange crackling sound, like branches snapping in the wind, but there was no wind to speak of. The air was stagnant, dense with the smell of humid rot. They crept forward, eyes scanning for the source of the noise. A moment later, Nisreen let out a soft gasp. Ahead, the dense underbrush had formed a twisting corridor of vines, large leaves shuddering in an almost rhythmic pattern. From their vantage point, it looked like a living throat, an esophagus of green, waiting for any fool who might wander in. "They're active," muttered Dana, her knuckles white around the rifle. "Must have sensed us." A large, funnel-shaped blossom dangled from above, curled like a cobra preparing to strike. Its petals glistened with a sticky substance. Digestive fluids, perhaps. One brush from a living creature would trigger the blossom's contraction, enveloping its victim in a crushing grip. Avery tried to swallow, her mouth dry. Another plan was needed. She motioned the group to circle north, which meant climbing a sloping ridge thick with red-veined ferns. The ferns were menacing, but less overtly so than the terrifying corridor of vines. Carefully, they ascended the ridge, using the trunk of a fallen tree for support. Above, the canopy parted just enough to let in a murky gray light. The leaves rasped together with a sound like whispering ghosts. Halfway up the ridge, Marco collapsed. He clutched his bandaged leg, face twisted in pain. Glenn and Nisreen struggled to keep him from tumbling down the slope. "We need to rest," Glenn urged softly, looking to Avery for affirmation. Avery glanced around. They were on an incline, but there were no large pods or gaping traps immediately visible. She signaled Dana to keep watch, while they settled Marco against the trunk. He winced, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's getting worse." His voice shook. "We tried to keep the wound clean, but everything out here is infected with that stuff." Avery knelt beside him, pulling open the bandage. A deep gash ran along his calf, inflamed with angry red streaks. She frowned. Perhaps a toxic thorn or an envenomed edge of some mutated leaf had caused the wound? Infection spread much faster in this environment. Before the cataclysm, a hospital could have handled it. Now she had only a tiny first aid kit. She drenched a cotton pad with disinfectant and pressed it to the wound. Marco let out a strangled cry, and Nisreen gripped his hand tightly. Meanwhile, Dana surveyed the area, scowling in frustration. "We can't stay here long. Even if the plants don't get us, we'll lose too much daylight." Glenn nodded. "We wait a few minutes at most. Then we move." Despite bracing themselves for more horrors, none of them were prepared for the sudden cacophony that erupted below. It started as a low rumble, a shifting of vines under tension, then a piercing shriek. Avery's stomach seized as she recognized the sound of a creature in excruciating pain. From their vantage point, they saw the corridor of vines below come alive, writhing like a pit of snakes. Something had walked into the trap. In the distance, a fleeting glimpse of scaly flesh disappeared under a swarm of leaves and vines. None of them spoke. The group merely exchanged grim looks. The realization was painfully clear. The forest would devour anything, be it human or animal. Avery forced herself to look away as the shrieking continued, then gradually fell silent. She refocused on Marco's leg, bandaging it as best she could. They set off again, helping him hobble along. The atmosphere weighed heavy with the stench of decay, remnants of countless creatures that had been swallowed up in these monstrous woods. After another hour, they reached a plateau. Beneath an overhanging ledge, they found remnants of a small camp. A circle of stones blackened by fire, some crushed tin cans and bits of cloth. This was not uncommon, as many travelers tried to find safety in higher ground. "We can rest here," said Dana, lowering her rifle momentarily. "If anything tries to come up behind us, we'll see it." Avery nodded, though she doubted any place could truly be safe. Glenn helped Marco sit on a mostly flat rock. As the faint light of dusk filtered through the twisted canopy, Avery checked her limited supplies. They had the 2 tins of questionable food discovered in the truck, a single packet of dried jerky and some leftover water. With trembling hands, Marco asked for one of the tins. Avery hesitated, suspecting it wasn't exactly a gourmet meal, but they had little choice. She pried it open with her knife, revealing mushy contents and a pungent odor. Despite that, Marco devoured spoonfuls of it, desperate for calories. Dana cleared her throat. "We'll make for Blossom's Edge in the morning." Her tone was firm, but uncertainty laced her eyes. "Anyone who gets in our way, plant or man, had better stand down." Nizreen clutched the scarf around her neck. "I can't believe we've come to this," she murmured. "Living each day as prey. My grandmother used to talk about jungles as if they were precious wonders. Now they're hungry nightmares." Avery's mind drifted to old stories she once heard, from a time before the farmland expansions, before the endless use of chemical fertilizers that jump-started the genetics of ordinary plants. Governments had ignored the warnings of ecologists, urging them to produce higher yields, faster growth. That focus on immediate gains had mutated into an unstoppable terror. Night settled, bringing a chilly gloom. The group huddled close, listening to distant rustling and cracks of vegetation. At one point, a thunderous crash made them all jump. Somewhere in the jungle, a giant branch or trunk had given way, perhaps devoured by strangling vine. After a restless few hours, Avery volunteered to take first watch, unable to sleep with her heart pounding so loudly. She stared out into the darkness, eyes scanning the silhouettes of monstrous leaves swaying in the gloom. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement, a creeping vine or a panting blossom, yet they did not move to attack. Perhaps the altitude here deterred them. Or maybe they were waiting. Plants had far more patience than humans. When dawn arrived in a scant trickle of gray light, Avery shook the others awake. Marco groaned, wincing from his injury, but managed to stand with help. Their progress was slow at first. They followed the plateau, searching for a route that led farther west. Both Glenn and Avery suspected Blossom's Edge lay in that direction, though neither had a precise map. The day's journey introduced new horrors. They passed a massive clearing where trees stooped under their own mutated weight. A pungent stench indicated that some animal had died there recently. Nestled amid spongy moss, they spotted a handful of enormous seed pods the size of watermelons. Their leathery surfaces bulged with hidden shapes. As the group inched by, one of the pods split open, releasing a swarm of tiny, spore-like seeds into the air. Panicking, they covered their mouths and noses, sprinting to escape. The spores fluttered around them, drifting lazily, and a few landed on Glenn's jacket. He cursed, knocking them away as if they were embers from a fire. Eventually, they descended into a ravine, stepping carefully to avoid stepping on large, root-like formations that twisted across the ground. One root in particular looked almost like a serpent, coiling ominously around a dead log. Dana aimed her rifle at it, suspecting movement, but Glenn checked more closely and motioned that it was safe enough to cross. They stepped over it gingerly, ears straining for any signs of ambush. Through the trees, Avery spotted a ragged trail of footprints, partially overgrown, but visible enough to follow. The forest there thinned out slightly, allowing more sunlight to break through. Could it be a sign they were nearing civilization? Or what passed for civilization these days? Dana, leading the way, raised her rifle in a moment of alarm. Ahead stretched a swampy patch of ground dotted with enormous pitcher plants. These were known to trap water and anything else that fell inside. Their gaping mouths looked large enough to swallow a grown adult. A murky liquid filled each pitcher, swirling with a greasy film of decomposed matter. None of them wanted to see what was at the bottom. "How do we get around this?" asked Nisreen, wrinkling her nose at the stench. Glenn scanned the perimeter. "We could circle, but that might take hours, or longer. We don't know what else is lurking around. Our best bet is to tread carefully between them." Avery sighed. Let's move slowly, watch for any shifting vines. Nobody touch the edges. In single file, they made their way across the marsh, stepping only where the ground seemed stable. The pitcher plants loomed on either side, each one's lip coated in a slick nectar-like substance. A hum of insects buzzed around them, drawn to the sickly sweet smell. Marco nearly lost his footing once, prompting a collective gasp as his boots sank into mud, inches from a drooling pitcher. Glynn pulled him upright, and they soldiered on. Eyes fixed on the far side, they suddenly heard loud snapping sounds behind them. One of the pitchers was closing. Something, a bird perhaps, had landed on its lip and been ensnared. The group quickened their pace, hearts pounding. More snapping followed, as if the pitchers sensed a larger presence in their midst and were preparing to devour anything within reach. At last, they emerged from the swampy patch, breathing heavily. Moments later, they glimpsed a crude sign nailed to a post, Blossom's Edge, 1 mile. Relief coursed through them, though no one dared celebrate out loud. With renewed determination, they pressed on, carefully stepping around entangling roots. Eventually, the trees began to grow farther apart. The mutated plants were still present, but less dense, as if kept at bay by something. Dana sniffed the air. "Smells like chemicals," she observed, detecting a faint tang that stung the nostrils. Indeed, the boundary of Blossom's Edge came into view, a ring of half-collapsed fences around what looked like farmland. But these weren't ordinary fences. Metal poles protruded with attached canisters, occasionally releasing wisps of a pale mist that clung low to the ground. In the distance, makeshift huts and tents huddled behind these barricades. A figure emerged near the fencing. He wore a gas mask, raising one hand in greeting but keeping the other firmly on a large crossbow slung around his torso. His voice carried across the short distance. "Halt there! Identify yourselves." Avery raised her palms in the same gesture of peace. "Travelers, we come from the interior, seeking refuge. One of us is injured." The man eyed their ragged group through opaque visor lenses, then beckoned them closer to step through slowly. "If you try anything, we shoot first." Cautiously they advanced. As they passed the perimeter, a pungent, acrid mist stung their eyes. The chemical barrier must have been the rumored deterrent. Here the plants still grew, but they seemed lethargic. Vines coiled on the ground, unmoving. Yellowing leaves drooped. Whatever mixture was being used, it appeared to sap the mutated flora's aggressiveness. Behind the fence, a small gathering of survivors approached. Women, men, even a few children with haunted eyes stared warily at the newcomers. Marco, limping and pale, was guided to a patch of ground near a smoldering fire pit. A wiry woman stepped forward with a makeshift medical kit, kneeling to examine his leg. Her wrinkled face was stern, but her hands were gentle. Dana lowered her rifle without completely letting her guard down. "We heard rumors of a compound that keeps the carnivorous plants at bay. Is that what this is?" She gestured at the chemical canisters. The masked gatekeeper nodded, pulling off his mask to reveal a young man's face, older than a teen but not by much. There was a tightness to his expression. "This is all that stands between us and certain death. We're nearly out, though. Keeping the perimeter covered is a losing battle, but it's safer than most places." Nicerine sank onto a wooden crate, exhaustion dragging at every fiber of her being. "So this is Blossom's Edge? Not much of a settlement, but it's something." A bearded man wearing a battered cowboy hat stepped forward. "Name's Hector. Welcome. We ain't got much, but we'll share what we can. We've been trying to farm what's left of the soil, but the nutrients all seem twisted. We rely on trade with scavengers who bring seeds and supplies, and they can get here alive." Avery scanned the sparse dwellings and subdued vegetation. She had imagined Blossom's Edge to be more fortified, perhaps with high walls and watchtowers. Instead, it was a series of hastily assembled huts with a ring of chemical fog. Still, it was the closest thing to safety she had encountered in a long time. Hector continued, "We're rationing everything, food, water, medicine, ingredients for the deterrent. If you're willing to contribute any labor or supplies, we can arrange for you to stay." "We'll help," Glenn agreed. "Just keep those vines off us." Marco groaned as the medic poured a clear solution onto his wound, his face contorted in pain. Dana stood next to him protectively, giving the medic an anxious glance. The woman treated his injury with a gentleness that implied she'd done this countless times, seeing the worst the forest had to offer. Avery exhaled. The swirling tension in her chest eased a fraction, though fear still loomed. They had reached their goal, but the war was far from over. At any moment the deterrent could run out. The plants might adapt to it, or the gates might fail. The thirst for survival meant forging new alliances and braving fresh dangers. Fighting back against the hungry green terror seemed impossible, yet every single person here clung to hope like a lifeline. As dusk fell again, the settlement prepared torches and additional canisters around the perimeter. The subdued hush carried a collective dread. No one knew when a new wave of vines might press in. The group of weary travelers, newly arrived, settled around a central fire. They shared the little food they had, passing around water rationed into chipped mugs. Conversation was whispered but comforting, forging fragile bonds. In that flickering light, Avery finally allowed herself to consider a future beyond mere survival. Perhaps, in a place like this, scattered minds could unite, discover new ways to beat back nature's deadly evolution, or at least carve out a pocket where life could continue. For now, though, the savage world outside pressed in, waiting for the slightest lapse. Dark silhouettes of twisted trunks and tendrils loomed beyond the chemical haze. The rising moon lent a silver glow to the trembling leaves at the boundary. Avery watched them, guarded but resolute, and whispered a silent vow. They would stand together against the hungry jungle for as long as it took. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but defiance was all they had left, and in a world where plants preyed on flesh, that determination might just keep them breathing one more day.